In the summer of 1839, the enslaved workers at Magnolia Ridge Plantation in Burke County, Georgia, developed an unusual morning routine. Every day at dawn, 4 men would carry buckets of heated water to a natural spring behind the main house. They would arrange soap towels and oils on the limestone rocks. And then they would stand there, in the water, while their owner, Mrs. Catherine Winthrop, bathed naked among them. This wasn't punishment. It wasn't abuse in any conventional sense. It was something far stranger, far more psychologically complex, and far more disturbing than the typical plantation horrors. Because Catherine Winthrop believed, with absolute religious conviction, that she was purifying these men's souls through proximity to white female virtue. She thought she was saving them. The enslaved community had a different word for what was happening. They called it the morning shame, and the psychological damage it inflicted would outlast the physical scars of any whip. This is the true story of how one woman's twisted religious ideology created a nightmare that county officials refused to investigate, that neighboring planters quietly ignored, and that her own husband enabled until the day it finally destroyed their family. This is suppressed history from primary court documents, plantation ledgers, and the testimony of witnesses who broke their silence only after Catherine Winthrop's death. This is what happens when moral delusion wraps itself in the language of salvation. Catherine Mercer was born in 1804 to a prominent Charleston family whose wealth came from rice plantations and the slave trade itself. She grew up surrounded by enslaved people, absorbing the contradictions of Southern Christianity that simultaneously preached black inferiority and the Christian duty to civilize the enslaved. But Catherine took these contradictions somewhere most slaveholders never went. She developed what she called her theology of purification through intimate witness, a belief system that would have sounded insane to most of her contemporaries if they'd ever heard her articulate it fully. Her journals, discovered decades later in a Charleston attic, reveal a mind that had convinced itself that physical proximity to white female purity could literally transform the souls of enslaved men. She wrote in 1837, 2 years before the bathing began, "The Negro male carries the double curse of Ham's lineage and masculine base nature. Yet Scripture promises redemption through witness to divine virtue made flesh. If I am made in God's image, then my form itself carries transformative power. To hide this power is to hoard salvation." Arrayed that again, Catherine Winthrop believed her naked body was an instrument of religious conversion. She thought enslaved men viewing her unclothed was a form of spiritual education. She had built an entire theological framework to justify what any reasonable person would recognize as sexually coercive exhibitionism wrapped in religious mania. In 1825, Catherine married Thomas Winthrop, a quiet Georgia planter 20 years her senior who owned Magnolia Ridge, a mid-sized cotton plantation with 47 enslaved workers. Thomas was deeply religious but conventional in his beliefs. He saw slavery as a necessary evil, perhaps, but not something requiring Catherine's brand of redemptive experimentation. For the first 14 years of their marriage, Catherine played the role of traditional plantation mistress. She managed the household, supervised domestic slaves, attended church, and gave no outward sign of the ideology developing in her private journals. But in 1838, Thomas suffered a stroke that left him partially paralyzed and largely confined to the main house. The power dynamics at Magnolia Ridge shifted overnight. Catherine, now 44 years old, assumed operational control of the plantation, and within months, she began implementing what she called her program of moral elevation. It started with mandatory prayer sessions. Catherine would gather the enslaved workers each Sunday and deliver long sermons about purity, virtue, and the possibility of redemption through witness to godliness. The enslaved community found these sessions strange but not particularly threatening. Plantation owners forcing religious instruction on slaves was common enough. What came next was not common at all. In June 1839, Catherine selected 4 enslaved men for what she called advanced purification training. Their names were recorded in her journal: Samuel, age 26, Marcus, age 31, Daniel, age 23, and Joseph, age 28. All 4 were field workers, all unmarried. All described in Catherine's writing as having faces that showed the struggle between base nature and possible grace. She ordered them to meet her at the limestone spring each morning at dawn. The spring was located about 200 yards behind the main house, partially hidden by magnolia trees, far enough for privacy, close enough that Catherine could walk there easily. The natural spring fed into a shallow pool about 15 feet across, with smooth rocks forming a natural bathing area that plantation families had used recreationally for years. On the first morning, the 4 men arrived to find Catherine already at the spring, wearing her full-day dress. She explained that they would be participating in a purification ritual that would cleanse their souls through witness to divine virtue. She instructed them to heat water, prepare her bathing supplies, and this is where the horror truly begins. To stand in the water with her while she bathed, keeping their eyes fixed upon her as she undressed and washed herself. Samuel, the youngest, would later testify that he thought she was testing them somehow, that this was a trap designed to justify punishment if any man showed sexual response. Marcus thought she had gone insane from isolation. Daniel believed it was some kind of elaborate humiliation ritual. Joseph said nothing at all during his testimony. He just stared at the courtroom floor. But Catherine was absolutely serious. She undressed completely, entered the water, and spent approximately 30 minutes bathing while the 4 men stood motionless around her, staring ahead as commanded, trying to show no reaction whatsoever. Catherine prayed aloud throughout, asking God to use her physical form as a vessel for their spiritual transformation. She quoted scripture about purity and virtue. She told them that witnessing white female sanctity, without feeling lust, was the first step toward redemption of their cursed natures. When the bathing ended, she dressed, dismissed them, and told them to return the next morning. This was not a single incident. This was the beginning of a daily routine that would continue for nearly 2 years, every morning at dawn, for 21 months. Those 4 men carried heated water to the limestone spring and stood in the shallow pool while Catherine Winthrop bathed naked before them, preaching about purification and redemption and the spiritual power of witnessing virtue without corruption. Rain or shine, summer heat or winter cold, the ritual continued. Catherine recorded each session in her journals with clinical detail, noting which men seemed to be progressing toward grace and which were still struggling with base nature. The psychological torture this created is difficult to fully articulate. These men were in an impossible position. Show any sign of sexual response, and they risked being accused of the ultimate Southern taboo, a black man showing desire for a white woman, an accusation that meant torture and death. Show discomfort or resistance, and they risked punishment for disobeying their owner. Show nothing at all, and they had to endure the daily humiliation of being treated as objects in Catherine's delusional religious experiment. The enslaved community at Magnolia Ridge knew what was happening. The morning routine was impossible to hide. Samuel, Marcus, Daniel, and Joseph would return from the spring each day silent and traumatized, unable to speak about what they'd witnessed. Other enslaved people began calling it the morning shame, though never within hearing of any white person. Women in the quarters tried to provide comfort to the 4 men. But what comfort could they offer? The men were trapped in a nightmare that no one with power would acknowledge as wrong. And here's what makes this story even more disturbing. Catherine Winthrop genuinely believed she was performing a moral service. Her journals show no awareness that she was inflicting trauma. She wrote about progress she observed in the men, moments when they seemed calm during the bathing, which she interpreted as spiritual growth rather than dissociative survival response. She wrote about her own sacrifice in exposing herself for their redemption. She saw herself as a martyr for their salvation. Some of you are wondering where Thomas Winthrop was during all this. He was in the main house, paralyzed and dependent on Catherine for care. Evidence suggests he knew about the bathing ritual within the first few weeks. Enslaved house workers later testified that they overheard arguments between Thomas and Catherine, with Thomas calling the practice unseemly and dangerous. But Catherine had theological responses prepared for every objection. She argued that Jesus himself broke social conventions to minister to the outcast. She cited biblical passages about purity being impossible to defile through mere physical exposure. She told Thomas that his discomfort revealed his own lack of faith in divine power, and Thomas, weakened by illness and deeply dependent on his wife, eventually stopped objecting. His silence was its own form of enablement. He could have sent for the sheriff. He could have contacted Catherine's family in Charleston. He could have sold the 4 men to another plantation to end their torture. He did nothing. He chose his own comfort over their protection. The neighboring planters also knew something strange was happening at Magnolia Ridge. Plantation communities in Burke County were interconnected. Owners visited each other. Enslaved people encountered each other at markets and church gatherings. Information traveled. Whispers circulated about Catherine Winthrop's unusual practices with male slaves. But plantation society had powerful incentives to ignore behavior that didn't fit comfortable categories. If Catherine had been whipping slaves to death, that would have been unremarkable, brutal but normal. If she'd been sexually exploiting enslaved men through rape, that would have been quietly tolerated as the unspoken reality of slavery's power dynamics. But what Catherine was doing didn't fit the standard plantation horror narratives. It was too strange, too explicitly articulated as religious practice, too difficult to categorize. So neighbors chose not to see it clearly. They made vague comments about Catherine being eccentric or overly religious, and changed the subject. This is how systematic abuse often continues. Not through active conspiracy but through collective decision to avoid confronting something uncomfortable. Catherine's behavior was protected by its very strangeness, by the fact that acknowledging it honestly would require admitting that slavery created conditions where this kind of religious delusion could operate unchecked. The four men developed different survival strategies for coping with the daily trauma. Samuel, the youngest, later described entering a dissociative state during the bathing sessions, where he would fix his eyes on a point beyond Catherine and mentally separate himself from his body. Marcus developed a kind of numb obedience, treating each morning as a task to be endured like any other plantation labor. Daniel attempted once to request reassignment to different work, but Catherine interpreted this as spiritual resistance and increased the duration of his participation as corrective therapy. Joseph, the oldest, simply withdrew into near complete silence. He stopped speaking to other enslaved people outside of necessary work communication, stopped participating in quarters social life, became a ghost of himself. The women in the enslaved community watched these men deteriorate psychologically and felt helpless to intervene. Hannah, an enslaved woman who later provided testimony, described the morning shame as killing them from the inside while leaving no marks on the outside. She said the four men became isolated from the rest of the community, unable to form normal relationships, unable to explain the specific nature of their trauma, even to people who cared about them. And Catherine Winthrop just kept recording her observations in her journals, utterly convinced she was documenting a grand spiritual experiment. She wrote in December 1840, Samuel shows increasing capacity for pure witness. Today he maintained composure for the full duration without averting eyes. The purification progresses. I believe within another year he may achieve the state of sanctified witness, where base nature is fully subjugated to spiritual observation. She thought she was curing them of lust. She was actually documenting their trauma responses. The end of the bathing ritual came not through any moral awakening, but through family scandal. In April 1841, Catherine and Thomas's adult son William arrived at Magnolia Ridge for an extended visit. William had been living in Savannah, managing family shipping interests, and hadn't been to the plantation in over 3 years. Within a week of his arrival, enslaved house workers later testified, William discovered his mother's morning routine. The confrontation that followed was volcanic. William was horrified not primarily by the psychological abuse of the enslaved men, though he did recognize it as abuse, but by the scandal potential. He understood immediately that if word of Catherine's behavior reached Charleston society, or the wider Georgia planter community in undeniable form, it would destroy the family's social standing. Slavery might be brutal, but it was supposed to maintain certain appearances. What Catherine was doing shattered those appearances. William threatened to have his mother committed to an asylum for insanity. He threatened to take legal control of the plantation from Thomas. He threatened to sell off the entire enslaved population and shut down Magnolia Ridge entirely. Thomas, faced with his son's fury and perhaps finally forced to confront what he'd been enabling, supported William's demands. Catherine fought back with theological arguments, but William was unmoved. In late April 1841, Catherine Winthrop conducted her final bathing session at the limestone spring. Her journal entry from that day shows no acceptance of wrongdoing, only anger at being prevented from completing the Lord's work of redemption. She believed to the end that she'd been engaged in holy mission. The four men, Samuel, Marcus, Daniel, and Joseph, were given no explanation for the sudden end of the ritual. It just stopped. One morning they weren't summoned to the spring. Catherine avoided them afterward, focusing her attention on household management and gradually withdrawing from plantation operations entirely. She died in 1847 at age 43 from pneumonia, having never publicly acknowledged that her purification program had been anything other than righteous Christian service. Thomas Winthrop died in 1849. In his will, he granted freedom to 4 enslaved men upon his death, provided they agreed to leave Georgia immediately. The names listed were Samuel, Marcus, Daniel, and Joseph. This was as close as Thomas ever came to acknowledging what they'd endured. A guilty posthumous gesture that freed them, while simultaneously exiling them from the only community they'd ever known. 3 of the 4 accepted the freedom and left Georgia. Records suggest Samuel went to Philadelphia, Daniel to New York, Marcus to Canada. Joseph refused the freedom. He chose to remain enslaved at Magnolia Ridge under William's ownership rather than leave. Make of that what you will. Perhaps the trauma had convinced him that freedom was more terrifying than the familiar hell he knew. The story might have disappeared entirely from historical record if not for a bizarre legal case in 1852. Catherine's journals had been inherited by her sister in Charleston, who discovered them while sorting through family papers. Horrified by what she read, the sister contacted a lawyer to determine if there was any legal recourse against Thomas Winthrop's estate for having enabled the abuse. The lawyer's investigation included testimony from Samuel and Daniel, who had been located in Philadelphia and New York, as well as from multiple enslaved and formerly enslaved people from Magnolia Ridge. The case went nowhere legally. Slavery made prosecuting the abuse of enslaved people nearly impossible, and both primary parties were dead anyway. But the testimony was recorded and filed in Burke County courthouse records, where it sat unexamined for over a century until historians researching plantation psychological abuse patterns discovered it in the 1970s. What do we do with a story like this? It doesn't fit neat categories of plantation brutality. Catherine Winthrop never whipped anyone. She never sold families apart. By the conventional metrics of slavery's cruelty, she might seem almost benign compared to the more physically violent slaveholders. But what she did was its own form of torture, psychological, sexual, and spiritual abuse disguised as religious benevolence and protected by the very strangeness that made it difficult for contemporaries to categorize and confront. The mourning shame at Magnolia Ridge reveals something important about how oppressive systems operate. The horror isn't always obvious brutality. Sometimes it's delusion wrapped in virtue, trauma inflicted by people who believe they're performing moral service, abuse that continues because it's too uncomfortable for observers to name clearly. Catherine Winthrop was a monster, but a monster who genuinely believed she was a saint. That combination, cruelty plus moral certainty, is often more dangerous than simple sadism, because it's harder to confront and impossible to shame. 4 men spent nearly 2 years trapped in a nightmare designed by a woman who thought she was saving their souls. The plantation system made that nightmare possible. The religious ideology of the time provided the language to justify it. The social structure ensured no one with power would intervene. And when it finally ended, it ended not because anyone recognized the men's humanity, but because family scandal threatened white social standing. Samuel, Marcus, Daniel, and Joseph carried the psychological scars of the mourning shame for the rest of their lives. Their trauma was inflicted by a woman who recorded it meticulously in journals, believing she was documenting spiritual progress. The records survive, the truth survives. This is buried history that reveals how slavery didn't just brutalize bodies. It created conditions where every imaginable psychological horror could flourish unchecked, sometimes wearing the mask of salvation itself. The limestone spring still exists on what used to be Magnolia Ridge. The property is now part of a nature preserve. People picnic there on summer weekends, probably never knowing that the peaceful water once hosted daily rituals of psychological torture disguised as religious purification. History doesn't always leave markers for its darkest truths. Sometimes you have to dig through courthouse archives and forgotten journals to find them. This is one of those truths. Georgia, 1839-1841. Documented, testified, suppressed for over a century, and now finally impossible to ignore.